Good afternoon, class. Our lecture this afternoon is going to be focusing on the arrival of the Spanish in Mexico. We started talking about this a fair amount in class this morning, but we also wanted in class this morning to lay some of the groundwork for the European, I guess, the steps by which Europe and European maritime or explorers were emboldened to consider a trip into the Western Hemisphere, and some of the motives and misinformation that in many respects turned out to be sort of happy mistakes for the Spanish, folks like Christopher Columbus. And we talked a bit about Columbus and his fate, some of the successes of his expeditions, but also how he sort of lived on and lived a somewhat ignoble final years prior to dying in 1506 after his 4 famous expeditions to the Western Hemisphere. We'll be looking today at the, as I referred to in class, sort of Exploration 2.0, the second wave of Spanish effort in the Western Hemisphere, where it built its vast domain in both Central and South America. We know that other European countries would quickly follow, countries like Portugal and the English and the French. But for the early 1500s in the Western Hemisphere, this was largely a time of Spanish success as they first met a whole host of native peoples in the Western Hemisphere, and how the fates of both sides, the Europeans from the east and the natives in the west, how their fates were both dramatically altered, in the case of the former for the in very favorable ways, and in the case of the latter in disastrous ways. So we left off talking about Cortez, and Cortez, as I mentioned, was a very ambitious member. I would call him sort of middle aristocracy in Spain, and like a lot of European explorers, Europe had come to a point where opportunities and prosperity, because Europe was rapidly developing and had a fairly robust population, even despite the consequences of the Black Death, for many young generations of Europeans, their fortunes and opportunities lay in other lands. Kind of like, we've experienced this throughout American history, the constant look to the western frontier for new opportunities and a chance to set out and strike it rich, whether you're looking for gold or looking for a homestead of land, or looking for a position of leadership in the relatively uninhabited lands. This phenomenon rung true for generations of Europeans starting in the 1500s. And so we'll start with Cortez. And Cortez, his story is interesting. He was a military figure within the Spanish military complex of the 1500s. You can imagine there was quite a demand for military people as Spain was turning its gaze outward for expansion and the hopes of new wealth. Many of these individuals were motivated, as we oftentimes refer to it, by God, glory, and gold. And Cortez was no different. In fact, he might be a little different in the sense that he was incredibly ambitious and yearning for opportunities for wealth and glory. But his story really begins in Cuba, where he was a ranking military official under the governor of Cuba, sort of a Spanish viceroy, who was a leader that the king and queen granted powers to in the Western Hemisphere. Cortez was authorized to make what would seem a fairly exciting mission to probe deeper into the interior of Mexico, which was a claim, the Spanish had made a claim to mainland Central and South America. His task was to go explore it, find out what it consisted of, and if these fabled stories of cities of gold and cities of spectacular feats, architectural riches, populations, things of that, if they were in fact true. So Cortez, as I was beginning to start to say in class this morning, he was given the authorization to start this expedition, but at the last minute, the governor of who is based in Cuba thought twice about it, and Cortez, knowing that if he were to wait and allow this official to reconsider his directive or instructions, might not give Cortez the answer he was looking for. So Cortez proceeded, just essentially neglected to honor the last minute rescinding of orders for him to continue with his expedition, and knew he didn't want to get a bad negative answer. So he proceeds essentially illegally. And he has the good fortune very early on, as he's wrapping around the northern coast of South America, heading toward the western end of the Gulf, he happens upon a couple native settlements which treat him very well. In one, he meets a Spaniard by the name of Geronimo de Aguilar, who had been essentially living in that area for a handful of years prior to Cortez's arrival. And in that process, Geronimo de Aguilar, who already spoke Spanish, also learned the Mayan languages of that region of eastern, what we'd call now eastern Mexico, sort of think of the Yucatan Peninsula. And this was important because very soon after, Cortez would meet and take sort of a captive. He traded for a young woman by the name of Malinche, who was significant because she spoke at that time the native language of Nahuatl, which is the language that the Aztec would speak, and she also spoke Maya. So what this meant was, through the processes of both Aguilar and Malinche, Cortez was well equipped to communicate with the various tribes he came in contact with, because he could speak Spanish to Aguilar. Aguilar could translate that Spanish into Maya. Malinche could then translate the Maya into Nahuatl when necessary. And so, as a result of these fortuitous circumstances, Cortez finds himself with the tools he'll need to communicate and succeed in his expedition. It's also worth noting that Malinche became essentially a concubine of sorts, and together they would have a child as well. So Malinche was not simply an interpreter, she was something of a love interest at the very least. She and Cortez engaged in sexual relations. Okay, so if we go through further, the events that transpire from here are interesting. Cortez has to overcome with just 300 to 500 men. He is early on finds himself having to overtake some tribes who were not happy to see these foreigners. These foreigners arrive with horses which were foreign to the people of the Western Hemisphere. They also had these big dogs, these bull mastiffs, that were a ferocious and scary sight. But ultimately, Cortez does prevail over some of these smaller tribes. And it's important to note that the Aztec, prior to the arrival of the Spanish, had been doing a lot to alienate themselves from many of the tribal peoples in the Yucatan Peninsula and larger Mexico. So after Cortez subdues these smaller tribes, he does actually find them quite willing to help him overthrow the powerful Aztec Empire. The Aztecs had been engaging in a number of practices that alienated them, the Aztecs, from their neighboring tribes. Among these practices were taking, essentially stealing members of these tribes and sacrificing them to their gods back at Tenochtitlan, the capital, the Aztec capital. You can imagine this didn't win them any favors with the tribal peoples found throughout Mexico. And the other practice the Aztecs had engaged in was charging tribute to the various people of their surroundings. So Cortez was able to play upon these existing frustrations and actually create a situation where some of these lesser tribes were willing to join the Spanish in going up against the powerful Aztec people. from 1519, Cortez is first going to contact the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan in 1519. It takes him 2 years to ultimately subdue and overtake these people. Part of it is because Cortez, as you'll recall, was not officially authorized to carry out this expedition. So he had to at various times go back to the Gulf and defend himself against other Spanish soldiers that had been instructed to come bring Cortez under control of the Spanish governor back in Cuba. Of course, having already discovered Tenochtitlan, he had relatively little problem convincing these people that they should just join forces with him, and that ultimately will prove successful. By 1521, the Aztec capital of millions of people will be fallen by the relatively small number of Spaniards under Cortez, but of course with the benefits of the alliances that Cortez formed with various other peoples. And we have multiple accounts of the steps and developments whereby the Spanish prevailed, some of which come from the Spanish conquistadors, like the account of Bernal Diaz del Castillo, but then others emerge later when Franciscan monks like Friar Bernardino de Sahagún, when he decodes the Nahuatl language and is able to tell the story from the Aztec perspective. And here's where we hear the stories of how mortified the Aztec were of some of the foreign nature of the Spanish. Their horses, their guns, their dress, their dogs, you name it. And of course disease plays a powerful role. By the time Cortez is interacting with the Aztecs, they have already started to succumb to the powerful impact of disease. I mentioned the role of people, tribal peoples in the East helping Cortez. The Tlaxcalans were a good example of this. They probably gave the most ferocious defense against the Spaniards, but when they're finally overwhelmed by the Spaniards, they did in fact find common cause and join Cortez. Cortez's dilemmas, again, he had to, pardon the misspelling here, he had to not only prevail against the Aztecs, but he had to watch his backside against efforts by his Spanish superiors from derailing his expedition. But when he finally does meet the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, here is a picture, a mural of it. You can see what a sight it was, and it was based in the center of Lake Texcoco in the low sort of swampy lands. This capital city had essentially been built by the Aztecs out of nothing. They had taken the soil at the bottom of the lake and piled it up in things, we would refer to these as chinampas, and so they essentially reclaimed out of nothing a land that they could build and find success with. I want to mention just briefly the early efforts of the church. Some of the earliest missionaries that followed very quickly on the heels of Cortez were Franciscan monks, and their challenge was to introduce the Aztec and other neighboring peoples to the Spanish faith of Christianity. And they did this. I put syncretic Christianity. Syncretic means that they took aspects of what the people believed, what these native peoples believed about their world, and adapted them to make sense of the Christian faith to these people. One example of that is the cult of the Virgin Mary, where they used existing beliefs that the Western Hemisphere, people of the Western Hemisphere already believed, and adapted that for Christianity's purpose. And of course they also rebelled and discouraged the incredibly barbaric practices, at least from the Spanish perspective, of human sacrifice. Finally, I'll close by saying encomienda was one of the organizing principles of society in this new Spanish colonial region. And encomienda allowed the conquistadors, so this first generation of settlers, to lay claim to the lands that they had conquered. And by laying claim to the lands, they not only gained land for themselves, but they also gained rights to the labor of the people who lived there. The purpose of encomienda was to allow the Spanish settlers to introduce the people to Christianity, and it expected that they would take good care of them, although we realized very quickly this would not be the case. And with that, I will close, and I will look forward to seeing you all tomorrow in class.